Welcome to Behavioral Grooves, the podcast that brings behavioral science to life. I'm Kurt Nelson.
And I'm Tim Houlihan. We like to investigate the aspects of behavioral science that will improve your well-being, your relationships, and your organization by helping you find your groove.
Okay, Mr. Tim, as often is the case, I have a question for you.
All right, shoot. Go ahead.
Okay. So you recently started a new job, right? You're working for a large organization with the intent of bringing behavioral science insights to bear on the organization. Is that correct?
Yeah, more or less, yeah.
Okay, well, probably less since I said it, but yeah, okay. But I was interested in seeing about if you're concerned at all about the scalability of the interventions that you are being brought in on.
Oh, yeah, totally. That is absolutely an issue, because one of the things that I continue to see is this wonderfully horizontal aspect of behavioral science that can be applied anywhere in the organization. The principles are universal, right? So it's anytime we get people involved, there's this broad horizontality about it. And at the same time, the tools get applied in highly contextual situations, right, that are not scalable. You know, I spent this morning working on emails.
Okay.
Just to work on email copy. I'm, in the review panel for what is going to be the best and most successful way to frame an email. So yeah, it's a challenge. It's a big challenge for me.
Yeah, and I think it's a common problem across many organizations, both for-profit ones, nonprofits, and governmental as well.
Absolutely. Yeah.
And our guest today, I think, is really at the forefront of this because she's exploring this to help identify and to understand how to ensure that behavioral science interventions are effective at scale.
Oh, she is definitely doing that, Kurt. Neela Saldanha leads the Yale Research Initiative on Innovation and Scale. It's called Y-RISE, the letter Y-RISE. And Y-RISE is focused on developing the science around scaling policy interventions. And as she says, and I quote, "I am a behavioral scientist by training and advise organizations on behavioral change, advocate for charitable giving, examine ideas around dignity, and try and fail to deliver credible rendition of Bach 875. Gotta love that.
I knew you were excited about that last part. I knew that. Yeah.
Of course, I was excited about that.
Well, we talked to Neela about the issues that companies and organizations have in taking initiatives to scale and some of the common roadblocks that behavioral scientists encounter.
Yeah, so her work sheds light on what we can do to improve the chances of success and what behavioral scientists, as well as anybody who's trying to lead change in an organization, what they can do to drive success.
Yeah, and it's important to know that this isn't just for behavioral scientists.
No, that is very true. So everybody who's listening, please sit back and enjoy the small intervention brew as we talk about how to scale that to your raging party of the year and enjoy our conversation with Neela Saldanha. Neela Saldanha, welcome to Behavioral Grooves.
Thank you.
It is such a pleasure to have you. We really have been looking forward to this for a long time after all of our reschedules.
A very long time. It's been fun.
So we're going to get started with a speed round. We'd like to just start with something simple. Coffee. Do you prefer homemade or Starbucks?
Homemade.
Homemade. All right. If you had to travel for vacation, would you travel with a fixed itinerary or no itinerary at all?
Somewhere in between.
Oh!
The classic compromise effect, right?
Yeah, there you go. Well, tell us about that. We have many people, when we ask them this question, they're always like, well, I need to have that hotel set up when I get there, but like the days in between, I can have some variability. Is that kind of where you are?
That's exactly it. I like to know where I'm going to stay. I don't think I could deal with that much uncertainty.
Yeah.
And maybe some idea of a few things. But then once I get there, I get very oppressed by the thought of we have to do this today and this tomorrow and this. And I think it's Ashley Willens, and she has a nice point where she says some people are events-based, calendar people, and some people are, I think, the other kind, like hourly-based. So someone will say we'll meet on Saturday morning-ish, and someone will say we'll meet at 10:30 on Saturday morning. I am definitely the former.
Okay.
we meet, Sunday evening-ish sounds good to have this discussion. As you can tell, when I even logged on to this one a little late. Yes, it's on Friday morning-ish. So that's why.
Yeah.
That's you and me are of the same ilk there. I would love to have my life, but the world doesn't always appreciate the 8:30-ish kind of start times, the Saturday morning-ish somewhere in there. They go, no, we need to know exactly when. So
yeah, okay, that's good. Okay, so which is a better piece of music to listen to when you're just getting your day started? A Bach fugue or a Beethoven symphony?
A Beethoven symphony, all of that noise and that get into it, especially like the first and third movements. I mean, the second movement is one of those calming.
Yeah, blah, blah, blah. You don't want to just start your day.
Take the afternoon nap. Let's take the afternoon nap during that.
And, can I just follow that up with any favorite symphonies from Beethoven?
Of course, the ninth. I mean, it's interesting that, I don't, I'm not, I would say I'm a middle brow classical music listener, right? So I don't really always love every part of a symphony. Okay. That's the one that I listen to all the all the sections, and each one is as brilliant as the other one. Mostly I'm like, you could have cut this out. Mostly heat that.
Wow. Wow.
But that one, so absolutely the ninth, I would say.
We're gonna have to have a discussion about that, because I'm gonna try to persuade you that the Sixth Symphony is really where it's at.
And I love all that rain coming down, the thing in the end, but I'm kind of like, no. And then one section of the oboe playing solo in the fifth is by far my favorite, like half a minute of music. And I always, I'm like, if I'm listening to it live, I'm like, please don't cough during this. Only 20 seconds, just hold it. Right. There's something about that single note.
Oh, yeah. The oboe absolutely nails it. Yeah, that's the star of the Fifth Symphony, absolutely. But we're coming back. We're going to talk. Okay, we're going to have that pastoral.
You get your music chance at the end,
all right.
Tim, hang on. All right. Okay, Neela, which side of you is happier today, the accountant side or the writer side?
I think the writer side. We're doing this podcast, right?
Good. It is. It's kind of
my accountant side was very like, I need to be prepared, and what paper should I read, and oh my goodness, they're going to ask me about this and I won't be able to cite this. So that was a little bit of that. But I'm going to go a little wild here and say writer side,
Okay. Well, good. We hope that we bring that writer side out, because that's really what we're trying to do here. And so, for those of you, we've been following you for years on social media, as well as some of the other work that you've been doing. But for those of you who, of our listeners who might not know about you, we gave an intro in the beginning. But can you tell us a little bit about the work that you're doing right now, and maybe just a brief history of kind of how you got to YRise?
Yeah. Great. So yes, I am the executive director of YRise, which is the Yale Research Initiative on Innovation and Scale. And as you can tell, it deals a lot with sort of researching scaling of interventions, specifically of interventions in policy and development. And the reason for that is the faculty director is Mushfiq Mubarak, and he's done some great studies on migration. Can you stimulate migration? And found that in pilot studies these things work really well. The little experiments we do, the randomized control trials that we do. But as you scale up an intervention, lots of factors come into play, and I'll just give you one simple one. So in development, you do run an intervention, very small scale. People are great, NGOs running it, that's great. Now imagine like taking a migration intervention and really scaling it to 2 million people, right? There's going to be political economy consequences of doing that. Suddenly people who, the political actors who weren't interested in this tiny little, intervention with 200 people are going to be very interested with what's happening when people migrate large scale. So the world, the development world, thanks to all the amazing work by, Michael Kremer and Abhijit Banerjee, Esther Duflo, and the ilk have done a lot in terms of innovation, in terms of randomized controlled trials and impact evaluation. So you have JPAL and IPA, SIGA, etc. And then we just assume that those pilot results will hold and we try and scale those, right? And at most, we might think of a few implementation issues. So YRISE actually fills that gap in terms of thinking about the complexities of scaling interventions. How I got here is interesting because I was involved in this huge, during COVID, a trial, a randomized controlled trial with, it was pretty huge, 600,000 people in Bangladesh to figure out if masks could actually, decrease community spread of COVID. This was right before the vaccines, right? And one of the interesting things there was that you can't force people to wear masks. It's a classic behavioral challenge. So you have to improve the uptake by doing various things. And, the researchers, I was not on the research side. I was more on the policy and outreach side of the project. But the researchers did a really good job in terms of looking actually at a lot of behavior science interventions, access, celebrity, like the local mosque leader telling people and figuring out what works to drive uptake up. And then that actually did have an impact on community COVID. So, for me, the impact is I still wear a mask, today. But I was working with that team, and that's how the lead researcher, one of the lead researchers, which is Mushfiq, then offered me the job to lead YRISE, because I think we saw the importance of outreach and policy. It's not enough to do good work. I think if you want to have good work actually get embedded in organizations, you have to talk about it. You have to figure out how to implement it further. And I think, that's the value of academics working with what I call academics like me, which is folks who've got some idea of what they're talking about. I don't want to read, page 3 of the paper, which talks about the model. I just want to get straight to, but I'm interested in translating evidence into action. And so I think that's where I am right now.
I love that. And, we've had this discussion. I'd like to kind of focus on this idea of scaling, because we've had discussions with people like David Yoakum, who has been working in, he's at the Brown Institute, Brown University Institute right now for Governmental Affairs, working on scaling issues that coming out of the Obama White House and saying, it's really hard to scale interventions because context is such an important part of it. And then on the other hand, we've had, guests like John List who are all about let's just eliminate all those ideas that just don't scale and let's just go for the ones that actually can. So tell us a little bit about YRISE and about the kind of work that you're doing to try to understand what those interventions are that can scale, and then how you overcome the challenges of things like context in order to get them to scale.
Right. So I do want to make a pitch for John's book, The Voltage Effect. I think it's absolutely fabulous and gives some really good lessons into what scales. And I think what we're doing is, first of all, we're in the policy, the development world, right? And there is the private sector scaling. But, having spent many years in the private sector and now in the development world, it's a completely different world altogether. The private sector is much more constrained in that constrained in a good way. I think there are metrics, there are ways to do it. There's a system. In the public sector, as I said, you start to scale something. There are all sorts of unintended consequences. There are political risks. Something that works at a small scale doesn't necessarily work at a large scale. So I'll give you an example. We're currently working on a project around what works to improve entrepreneurs, very, very small entrepreneurs. We're talking about people with 1 or 2 employees, which you typically find a lot in a lot of countries outside of maybe the US and the global north. What works to improve these entrepreneurs' productivity? Expand their business and so on, because that would get them out of poverty. And you might think about all the complexities. So there are lots of programs that have been tried with good results, right? Do you train them on business skills? Do you train them on sort of, just getting more visionary about their business? Do you train them on soft skills? Do you train them on like P&L? What is it that you need to train them on? There is evidence around what works. But you can start to think about the complexities of scaling this once you take a program from 1,000 individuals to, a million. First of all, there are costs involved, right? At small scale, training one-on-one is good. At large scale, that might not work. And so you'd be tempted to say, well, let's just move digital. Let's stop doing but you might lose fidelity, or what John List calls voltage, right? When you from that. So that's one complexity. But then imagine others. For example, you might find there are, and I should sort of preface this by saying I'm learning a lot of this, relearning a lot of this work. My undergrad was in economics, but clearly trying to get back to it after a bit. So there are all these what you'd call general equilibrium effects, right? If everyone is trained, do you then lose? So you typically in a pilot study, you say controlled treatment, you say these people got the treatment, they got trained, they did much better. But now imagine where the entire sort of the C level has moved up for everyone. Everyone is trained now. There's a new average. Do those results still hold? Once everyone has reached a certain level, that difference might just tend to. So what was good in a pilot stage may not show those results at a scale stage. You've just reached a new average. Or what I was talking about earlier, maybe these entrepreneurs get trained and then they get so well trained that they now know what their rights are. They know how to advocate. They start to become, not as pliable as they were. So they start to become an active political constituent. And, would that have some unintended consequences? So you've got to think about those. One thing we do say, and people, say, well, does that mean we have to do all the research before we scale? We really can't afford that, right? Especially given global poverty challenges. We say no, actually, what we're trying to do is as you're scaling to identify some of these complexities and so that we can learn and iterate and design better. And the only other thing I'll say is that it's not as simple as it sounds. When I joined Y-Rise, I was like,
it's not simple at all. I don't think it even sounds simple.
We should just do the research. I mean, just get a bunch of researchers and do the research and we should know this tomorrow. The problem is that I think you have to get people with different methodological. You have to get some econometricians in to say, we've seen 20 studies. Will this apply to the 21st study? What can we tell you about the effects of that? You have to get in the political economy people who say, wait a minute, I know a little bit about incentives and political actors, so I can tell you, you have to get, the folks who do the actual fieldwork. And you might have to get in, from an economic standpoint, the macroeconomists to say, what's the long run effect on the economy? Can we model that? So, and then you get in the public health folks if you're doing a health intervention.
Yeah.
So it quickly gets complicated. You don't want it to become so unwieldy that, you're spending time researching something for 15 years and then you don't have an output. So we're in the process of figuring that out and doing that. But I think there's a lot of scope to think about, to really think more systematically about complexities of scaling. So we're looking at, workforce development, migration, to avoid what you call seasonal poverty in many parts of the world. There is this particular element of poverty between planting and harvesting. Interestingly, there are jobs, temporary jobs, construction workers, whatever, in nearby cities. People don't migrate there, but it turns out, and this is, Mushfiq's work, that if you do give them a bus ticket, it's like $10, $11, a round trip bus ticket and a couple of meals, they migrate and they find work in the neighboring city. And what's interesting is that their families back home get the equivalent of one extra meal, like 600 calories per person because of that increased income.
Wow.
And all it took was like that bus ticket, right?
The short-term bus ticket to get them, to allow them to go that. Yeah.
Because an economist will say, well, if it's such a huge return, why wouldn't they have just saved up a little bit or taken a loan and done this, right? I mean, why would you just not, if you can calculate that? I think the problem for people who live in sort of extreme poverty is that one small slip is kind of fatal in some sense. Mm-hmm. So they just wouldn't take that risk at all. And what they find is actually once they do that, the next year, even without those subsidies and without that ticket, they're migrating because now they've learned that if I go, I'll do it. But how am I going to take that first step? So, we're looking at that. Can you scale that? It's great if 100 people migrate from a village. What happens when the entire village empties out? And actually, does that have effects on people staying back, right? Does it have welfare effects on those who stay back? If now this becomes a way to earn your living, like just be out of the house for 6 months in the year. So yeah, migration, workforce development, public health, interventions in public health, and a lot of other mental health has become a big issue now. So other interventions to improve those at scale. So lots of exciting work.
Yeah. We talked before we started recording, and you were talking about this idea of bringing behavioral science into the wild, what we were just talking about here, and some of the, as you said, it seems like it should be easy. We do a pilot study, it works there, and you should just be able to translate that. And obviously, we've just talked about a whole bunch of reasons why that isn't true. But we also talked about the idea of behavioral science applying its own tools on behavioral science. And so can you talk a little bit about some of your thoughts on that? Because again, I think as you were mentioning that the number of interventions that we do as we're that actually get put into motion is pretty dismal when we think about it.
So I love this recent working paper I read by Kim and Elizabeth Linos and Stefano Della Vigna, which they actually took 73 RCTs by the Behavioral Insights team and saw how many of those were then working with local governments in North America. So this is as quote unquote clean of an environment to do the study. I mean, they could actually track all of those 73 RCTs, by the way. So there was to see how many had been adopted, and they found that about 27% had been adopted. So like less than a third. And you're talking about, RCTs run well by the Behavioral Insights team, with city governments. So what was really interesting, of course, so first of all, the adoption rate being that low, I mean, that's something as behavior scientists is definitely an outcome for us to sort of improve, right? We talk about, we want to, increase tax or tax compliance, and we want to do this. But what about increasing, just adoption of RCTs into practice? But what they found what I thought was really interesting was that it wasn't the strength of evidence, interestingly enough, that sort of predicted that. So it's not that, and this is our system 2 kind of mind. If the evidence is great, people would adopt it. That actually was not the case.
Of course.
It was a little bit to do with what they call organizational capacity. And very interestingly, if the person who ran the RCT was responsible stayed in that position, they were more likely to implement. But the main thing that they found was that it's what they call organizational inertia. So they found that if the communication program was already in the budget of the government, then doing a little tweak on this, they were likely to adopt it. But if it called for a new communication program, even if it's costless, even if you say it's digital, let's just run. So it wasn't about the cost of a program. It's just about we have to run this new thing, then the adoption fell dramatically. And so, we don't often think when we're running interventions whether the organization's already doing this, whether this is a tweak to an existing advertising that they're doing, or this is new advertising. We're like, well, if it's digital, it might be zero cost, but actually it isn't zero cost. And so I think as behavior scientists, we've got to apply our own science to organizations and say, like, what are the bottlenecks that are keeping organizations from actually implementing these sort of things. And that's something I'm fascinated by.
Are there some bottlenecks that you see consistently?
So I think this idea of sort of, using the sort of East framework, making it easy, right? And this idea that, and the status quo bias is so high. So this idea that, and I've said this now 100 times, maybe this is one of those things I will be like, I've said this 100 times, but, my favorite story is when I was at Pepsi and trying to sort of set up this, we should set up a nudge unit, whatever, and talking to a VP about it, a vice president, and she listened carefully and she's like, great. So where is it in the strategic planning, in the strat plan? And I was like, what strat plan? And she said, is it in the annual budget? And I'm like, no, it's a great idea. I'm sure we'll find money. And she's like, look, if it's not there, it's going to be really hard because every initiative that the company wants to do is there. And you can't just suddenly come out of nowhere. Where are you going to find the money, the resources, the people, etc.? Taught me a huge lesson. Like, if you want to be good behavioral scientists, we have to actually be good budget and planning people. And we've got to actually so I think that's my big lesson. You've got to actually spend as much time understanding the organization. I mean, really understanding their planning and budgeting process if you want to implement something in the organization. I think that's definitely.
Neela, I couldn't agree with you more. Actually, Tim and I were just at a conference in England with the Diversify network as well as the CBO group. And one of the things that we talked about there, which really ties into what you were just saying, is you can have the best behavioral interventions in the world, but you have to fit it into the organization in a way that the organization is willing to accept it. And that comes down to understanding the strategy, understanding the budget. How do you get something funded within an organization? You can have a nudge unit, but if you're not going to be able to get the budget to implement these at anything larger than that, you're going to fail to begin with, right? And I think that is a big piece that many of us, right, us behavioral scientists, when we think about this, it's like, well, if the research shows that it works, then we should be able to implement it. But that's not how it works.
Yeah, we have system two thinking too, behavioral science. The other, you asked me about, so that's one. The other one is social proof. We actually really underestimate how much people will adopt something if they see other people in the organization adopting something. And I've seen this time and time again. So you tell people about behavior science, they love it, they love the stories, and they're like, great. And now I'm going to go back to my regular work. And you're like, well, what happened there? So I find it much more effective to just start with whoever's willing to start an experiment or set of experiments with you. This has happened, in my private sector work. This happened when I was founding the Center for Social and Behavior Change. You can't persuade people of things that don't exist yet. So you start and then you run through everything and then you actually say, well, they adopted it, and then everyone sort of jumps on the bandwagon. So I wish there were more research into how social proof works within organizations to adopt behavior change or to adopt these kinds of interventions. Are you more likely to adopt something if somebody more high profile in the business unit adopts it? The big business unit, if North America did that, or are you more likely to adopt something if lots of people have done it before? What is it that really drives that? I would love to see more work on that. But that's something I think was actually, so obviously making it easy, but also making sure it's an existing, dealing with status quo bias, and then this idea of social proof. I think a couple of those. It's funny. It's all behavior science.
It's all behavior science, isn't it? I mean, pretty much everything is, right?
You frame it well. You frame it in a particular way. You show social proof. It's all of that.
So we talked a little bit about scaling. What's next? What is next on your what are the wicked problems that you're hoping to solve?
So the wicked problem, first of all, is I think how do we scale more effectively? And there's this other sort of really interesting paper I was reading which said that obviously the characteristics of an intervention and the context in which that intervention, we know this, but she's actually quantified it to show that that's a big part of the kind of the treatment effect heterogeneity, the fact that effects are different from one study to the other. Yeah. So I think I'd love to, these two challenges, how do you adopt more successful interventions? That's one. But the second one is this, how do you scale an intervention? So one thing in my world, the development world, is she shows that when NGOs and academics run a study, the effect sizes are much higher than when governments or, other parties run that, right? And yet, so many of our pilots, and I think that's true even of the work with the nudge units, they found that, the initial studies had much higher effect sizes than when the studies were scaled. And yet think about how many of what we preach is essentially studies run by academics who tightly control everything. And we say, well, they got a 30 percentage point or, 10 percentage point uptake. And we don't actually say, well, you might get a 2 percentage point uptake because people would find that very demotivating. But that's something we need to think about. So I think I'm very excited actually with a partnership that we are starting with BRAC. So BRAC is the world's, by some measures, at least definitely one of the world's largest NGOs. They've been amazingly successful in Bangladesh with doing things as simple as getting oral rehydration solutions to combat diarrhea. It's really simple, right? It's salt and sugar, and you have to tell mothers and parents and caregivers about this. And most people do the reverse when their kids have diarrhea. They prevent them from fluids because diarrhea is a fluid. You want to prevent diarrhea, so you don't give them the solution. The solution is actually just taking water, salt, and sugar. It works really well. And they did a fabulous job in making this available and really were instrumental in a lot of, Bangladesh's public health has been pretty spectacular over the years in terms of their improvements, and BRAC is a big part of it. So one thing is, what I'm excited about is we're working with them to say, you folks know how to implement things well. You're great at implementing at scale. We have all this sort of thinking that we have about the complexity, the scale. Let's put that together and sort of evaluate some of these large scale programs and, lessons for the world. So I'm excited because also they're an organization based in the global south in Bangladesh. So I think it'll also be lessons from, where most of the world lives, not the other half, actually 88, to maybe, North America. So I'm excited about partnerships like those, where we actually tackle these wicked problems of, how do you get behavior science and general policy interventions to scale.
That's cool. I love this idea of sort of relying on people who already have this expertise. Let's have a bigger table. Not to the point that it weighs down decision making or execution, right? But bring in the people who can actually get things done. That's a very cool approach.
The challenge is how do you work with large, sophisticated organizations and then push the conversation, right? It's really easy to say, I did this one not easy, but it's relatively easier to say, I did this randomized control trial. It's great, everyone should do it. It's much harder to then actually implement it in the organization.
Yeah.
And so how do you do that and what do you do? And I think it's, you can't do it with one-off partnerships because if it doesn't work, it's seen as a failure. I think you have to have that like a long marriage that you have and there's lots of, things that don't work and then one thing really works and you're like, wow, it was worth it. I'm not sure my poor husband would like me to describe our marriage.
I love it though. That's a really interesting concept.
You're there, you're committed, commitment device, right? You're there, you can't.
Well, but even just the what you talked about earlier in the idea that those policymakers that stayed in that position, it was more likely to get some of those things in there. This idea of having a long-term element to this, because as you said, if it fails, then it's a failure and I'm looking bad. But no, this is one piece of information as we're moving forward in a long-term effort to move these things forward. And I think oftentimes, at least in the work that I've done with organizations, it is that exact same thing. And if you get brought in for one intervention, one piece of work, right, you are on this, you're put up in the spotlight and everybody's eyes are on you. And, as you said, it can work really well in a randomized control trial, but then you start implementing it larger and that 10% improvement that you promised now becomes 1 or 2 and they don't see that result or even maybe not at all. And therefore you get kind of blacklisted on that thing. And so it's looking at these and saying, how can we make sure that this partnership is going to last longer than just this one? Because that's where the power comes in, right? We learn given the context of whatever the organization or the systems that we're working in.
And I think, we really need new organizations and new ways of thinking around this. So your classic sort of consulting firm, and I've worked in consulting firms, their model isn't always set up for this, right? With good reason. You come in, you do a 3-month project, you have to staff people, and then you have to go out.
Yeah.
I think they're great to demonstrate proof of concept or to do something that you've never done before. We used, when I was at the Center for Social and Behavior Change, we had no idea how to run these interventions. So I did a bit of Googling and found out that the Busara Center for Behavioral Economics was doing something similar in Kenya, right? So we called them over to say, can you help us with this? And sure enough, they really helped us to get some of those experiments off the ground. So I do think you need expertise to you have to buy things initially just to get it started. But I think we have to think about those cracks and those sorts of who's going to be the translator for this work, right? Who's going to be that bridge builder? When do you actually, and I think we have to start to think about the behavior science ecosystem as comprising more than we're either academics who are going to do some cool stuff for data, or we're consulting firms who are going to come in for 3 months. We've got to think about like who fills in these cracks and gets this scaffolding so that organizations can actually have those long-term partnerships. Who's going to be the one to say, it's okay, like this is I've seen this failure before, wait, it'll get better. Because there's the incentives aren't set up for either the organization or say for the consulting firm or the academic to come in and have that conversation unless a ton of trust is built up. So that's something for us to think about, I think.
Oh, yeah.
Amen. Amen.
Yeah. I love that. I absolutely love that.
It's difficult. There's not funding for it. It's not seen as it's not seen as unfortunately, these long-term things are never seen as the thing, because you can't actually, and we have to think about what measure we use to, we talk about measuring stuff, right? So what measure would we use to say that that's a good investment? But that would be interesting.
Well, and I always find it interesting too that the measurement often in the pilot you can do it again easier, right? You can measure certain things, but once you get into that larger, trying to scale it up, the measurements often fall down to what is easy to measure as opposed to what is there, what you're really trying to get at, because it's just very difficult in order to get some of those other measurements. And so you find that all the time, and you're going, organizations can't necessarily look at how effective something is if you're not measuring the right pieces.
And that's why I'm so excited about Y-Rise, because I think, and now we're talking way beyond my methodological capabilities, but I think that is the problem we recognize. So running an RCT requires, or randomized control trial requires a specific set of skills, but they're tractable. I mean, they're a certain set of skills. Once you start to say, well, how do we measure, welfare effects of, people leaving villages? Suddenly you're like, oh, okay, maybe, it's not just this. Let's try and call in some other method. Sometimes there are things you can't ask people, right? So, what sort of data would you require to see these patterns, and how do you interpret that? So I think, but it's much harder. So it's much easier to do things within a certain methodological track than I think it is to get, the interdisciplinary problem all the time. So while I have a lot of hope, it's also much harder. It always looks insurmountable in the short run. But I think we're trying to do exactly that, to say, let's go beyond what is measurable in a particular RCT and actually try and look at other sources of data and see whether we can sort of make some good estimates as experts to give you a sense of what, whether this thing will scale well or not, or what those effects might be at scale. You got this 30% effect here. What might that look like at scale, so that you can then decide as a policymaker whether you want to sort of invest those resources or direct them elsewhere.
Well, it may be impossible for me in the short term to even conceive of persuading you that the Pastoral Symphony is a better piece of music than Beethoven's Ninth. But
I like the fireworks. What can I say? I'm not for the subtle.
Okay, that might have been a little heavy-handed, but we would like to we're kind of curious about what music would you take to a desert island with you? If you just had a year on a desert island, assuming that this would all be wonderful, and you only had 2 musical artists to take with you, what would be the 2 artists? You could take their entire catalog.
So I'll caveat this by saying my musical tastes are extremely crazy because so I learned piano, and that's why I sort of but in piano, as I've now discovered, I have vast gaps in my repertoire. So my piano teacher will say, oh, like there's this well-known piece. I'm like, never heard of it. So, but consistently, I mean, if you're to ask me one composer, all my friends and family know it is Beethoven. My husband actually made me this lovely artwork about Beethoven as a Christmas present because,
oh my gosh,
that's lovely.
So that's the one sort of, competitor to his affections, I think. So,
Wow.
it could be good old Ludwig. And then I'm not sure about the others. Then I think some Bollywood music. I'm not sure there's a particular composer, but I think I would have like a whole lot of Bollywood music. Maybe R.D. Burman is an older composer that I love, and again, large gaps, but been listening to a lot of that. So two different kinds of music, I think. There's the classical, full of emotion, and there's the fun sort of Bollywood.
Well, yeah, there's emotion and all that fun too.
Oh, tons of
it.
Yeah.
All that Bollywood stuff with all of its sparkle and, pizzazz is plenty emotional. It's just maybe not quite as deep as a Beethoven piano concerto, but yeah.
A lot of people would disagree with that.
That's possible.
What do you mean? I mean, these are just notes. That is music.
Yeah.
These are just
Neela,
notes.
it is such a pleasure having you as a guest on Behavioral Grooves. We hope you'll come back, but thank you for sharing your time with us today.
Thank you. Thanks so much. I really enjoyed this.
Welcome to a grooving session where Tim and I groove on what we learned with our discussion with Neela, have a free-flowing conversation, and talk about whatever else comes into our scaling brains.
Scaling. It sounds
Notice
like we have scales.
there's a kind of... What's it called when it has two meanings? What's that?
A double entendre.
A double entendre with that, yes. Yeah. Your brain and my brain, we have scaling brains. There we go. That's all I'm going to say.
Yeah. Meaning like we're...
Interpret it how you will.
So we had a great conversation with Neela. Kurt, what did you come away with? What was salient for you in this conversation?
That it's not enough to do good work, that you have to talk and think about how to implement that further, and the idea of how do you take something that is small and bring it up to scale, if that's indeed what you're trying to do. I mean, it's great that we can go in there and we can do a pilot, or we can do an experiment, or we can do a small little survey and study and show, wow, we are bringing some really amazing insights and performance improvements with what we're doing. But then we need to be able to take that small intervention and ensure that it is going to have the same or at least good impact at a larger scale.
Well, and how much did this remind you of our conversation with John List?
Oh, my gosh.
The great economist whose book, The Voltage Effect, was just fantastic.
Yeah.
Where he really actually got into the nitty-gritty of defining the steps that we need to go through when we're thinking about moving from, an idea that we think is really great to have on a large scale, but actually moving it to large scale, to scalability, is a totally different story. And of course, I mean, we had a great conversation with John, but I think
Neela was saying, go out and read that book as part of the conversation that we had with her. Yeah, it was really interesting to me to see the overlap, because there's a lot of the work that Neela's doing and the work that John is doing on this. I think they pair really nice together, and it's really interesting because when you think about scaling, as Neela was talking about, there are a lot of these issues that we don't always take into consideration, like costs. She was talking about, well, you do the small intervention and it's a one-on-one counseling type thing. Well, can you do one-on-one once it starts getting up above, a few 50 to 100 people? Maybe not. You're thousands and tens of thousands. That might just be cost prohibitive. There are a number of other elements that, the cost compares into. Does the effect not hold? Does this change because now we've taught people something, and because now we've taught the vast mass of people something, the impact, the effectiveness of it is changed because they have a different viewpoint, and so what we're trying to do with them doesn't work. All of those things are there. The focus, the amount of attention that things get at scale versus at smaller piece. Is it just one more program with the myriad of tens and 20s and 30 other programs that are going on, and people are just going to go, oh, ho-hum, here it is. It doesn't have that, definitive focus. So I think all of those things need to be thought about. And this isn't just, Neela's working a lot with like big governmental components and various different, policy
NGOs,
pieces, NGOs.
Yeah.
But this happens in, an organization like yours, a mid-sized organization, even small organizations.
And this gets back to one of the reasons why I've been a fan of Neela's work for several years, is that she is so ardently committed to the nonprofit sector.
Yeah.
She's really interested in policy intervention. And I mean, the work is inspirational, but it also reminds me that just as you said this, and I'm just re-emphasizing something that you just said, Kurt, but the problems in for-profit and non-for-profit are equally as big when it comes to scaling these things. Yeah. And so I think that what she has, what she brings to the table is just really important.
Well, and one of the things she said, and I'm going to quote this, she said, in the public sector, as I said, you start to scale something and there are all sorts of unintended consequences, unquote. Those unintended consequences, they happen in the public sector. They happen in the private sector as well.
Absolutely.
All the time. I mean, this is what deal with on a day-to-day basis when we're working with these clients, and particularly around their incentive programs and a variety of other things. They put an incentive program in and then they go, well, why isn't the behavior changing like we thought it would? Or actually maybe sometimes opposite the way we intended it to. And I'm going, because you didn't take into effect some of these other unintended consequences of how people are interpreting these in various different aspects.
Yeah, or just what it does in the world. How about the idea of choosing early on in the development of the automobile to not continue to invest in electric engines, but to invest in gas engines, gasoline. And, here we are 100 years down the road and there's real problems. No way that could have been anticipated in the early days. No way. Yeah. Who would have known? And yet here we are. So when we can anticipate things that can go awry, I think we need to do that. Something else that she talked about was about budgets. And this struck me particularly importantly because here I am in a new role, in a company who is made a pretty big commitment to make behavioral science part of their thing. You've got to have a budget for it. You have to say, this is where we stand. I mean, you and I were in London, a couple of months ago, talking to practitioners in their behavioral science roles in their companies. And man, if there's no budget, shit doesn't happen. It just doesn't. And so it takes leadership standing up and saying, we're going to have a budget to get things done. And we're going to have if we want a behavioral science lens, there's a cost to it. And it's going to be difficult to measure the specific ROI on some of that work too.
And I think the important piece there is this idea that if we really want to be effective as behavioral scientists, so for the behavioral scientists that are listening in the audience, we have to become better business people, particularly if we're working with organizations. We have to be able to understand a budget planning process. We have to understand how to, all right, if we can't get an exact ROI, how can we estimate the ROI? What are some of the other ways that we can measure the impact that we have in order to demonstrate this to, again, go and fight for that budget? Because budgets are, within an organization, they don't just go, hey, here you go, take some more money, give it up. They're going to be fighting for that money because other departments, other divisions are going to be looking for that as well. And Absolutely. If they have a better argument, if they have better data to support them, that is putting your budget at risk. And as you said, without a budget, nothing happens.
Yeah. So once the behavioral scientists within the organizations learn to speak the language of the business leadership, then if we can get to a point where we can demonstrate some kind of an ROI, some kind of a return on investment, then we move away from just the budget users to budget makers. And if we can move into a budget making mode, then we move away from HR that is, that never really figured out, and you and I have had this conversation offline,
but my gosh.
HR never really figured out how to get a seat at the table because they couldn't really demonstrate what the investment in human capital really means to the organization. I think we might be getting closer to that these days. But I think that there's a risk that practitioners of behavioral science face if we don't move from just budget takers to budget makers.
I love that. I also, one of the things that Neela said was that as behavioral scientists, that we are not thinking hard enough about how to change behavior for behavior science. And so this, I think, is the other piece of this that I'm like going, we hold the lens to everybody else, but we need to hold that lens to ourselves as well.
Yes.
And that, I think, was just, when she said that, it was like, oh, it hurts to hear that. But yeah, it's so true. It's so true.
Yeah. Well, and I was so grateful to have that conversation with her, because shortly after that, I found myself in a meeting with somebody saying, well, we want to do this marketing material, and then we're going to learn about the customer in this particular platform, and we want to market to them on this other platform. Is that going to be cool, or is that going to be creepy? And I thought, well, here's an opportunity to actually look at something that could be studied and then contribute to the body of work in behavioral science, that we might learn something about the human condition in a way. And I'd have to give a shout out to Neela for helping see that. So I'm just grateful for that.
Fantastic.
She broadened my lens. Anyway.
There you go. Well, cool. Well, I think that probably wraps this episode up. Do you think so?
Yeah. It was such a great conversation, and thanks to Neela I think we tried to schedule this for 9 or 10 months. So thanks to her for doing that, and thanks for providing such insights that we can all use. It was just fantastic.
Yeah. And as you said, you've already tried. I mean, some of these insights you've already tried out. Are you super excited to even try more of these within the company? Yeah.
Damn right I am. I'm super excited. I want to implement these concepts because I could just see all of Neela's comments playing out in the world that I live in.
Yeah, that's right. And listeners, you too should go out this week and see how you can scale the groove in your life.